Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we all love each and every day. Best discussion, debate, and analysis. That's the mission. Got Jackie Franchuli on the line, allgators.com on SI. Well, there's been some recent coaching shakeups that you'll have to sort out for us, especially on the defensive side.
Yeah, Florida's been busy as far as coaching changes. It was something that happened pretty quickly after the bowl game. Both Ron English and Torian Gray parted ways with Florida. Dan Mullen did hire two DB coaches in Jules Montanar and Wesley McGriff. So obviously, if you're an SEC fan, you're very familiar with Wesley McGriff. He's a former Auburn DB coach, so he'll bring some SEC experience to Florida. And obviously, he recruits some of the same players, so they're really familiar with each other. But Florida also had to do a quick change on the offensive side. Now, this one is the one where this one kind of hurts. Brian Johnson, the quarterback's coach and offensive coordinator for Florida, left for the NFL, and he's now with the Eagles. Now, they promoted Garrick McGee over to become a quarterback's coach. No word who's going to be the offensive coordinator. Now, first we heard that possibly McGee would have been the OC as well as quarterback's coach. But that has kind of shifted, and they moved him to quarterback's coach only, and that hasn't changed anything from the last 24, 48 hours. The other consideration is they may move Hevesy and Gonzalez again to co-OC. Don't forget, before Brian Johnson was promoted last year to offensive coordinator, Hevesy and Gonzalez were kind of co-OC. So Hevesy was the run coordinator and Gonzalez was the passing coordinator. So that is something that we could possibly see maybe this year again. They have a dual threat quarterback as well. So maybe that's kind of their idea where they, were considering more of that two-guy offensive coordinator when they had a dual threat guy. So that's possibly something that they consider moving forward. Obviously, the offense is going to look different as well because Emory Jones is there. But Brian Johnson, obviously, if you look what Kyle Trask has been able to do, was developed into a good quarterback. Obviously, Dan Mullen is known as a quarterback whisperer, but Brian Johnson was also a key part of his development. The other thing is we know that Brian Johnson was well-loved and well-respected among the Florida Gator community and was often known as the gel that kept the staff together or the kind of the gel among the offense. Everyone really liked him. So you're losing that well-likable guy from your team, but also a well-likable and well-respected guy on the recruiting trail. We talked about this earlier, that Florida still struggled a little bit on the trail, but a lot of their successes was due to Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson was their best recruiter. He was also in charge of South Florida. So that is a huge loss for them. I'm not saying they're going to have a huge drop. Maybe, obviously Wesley McGriff has done a good job as a recruiter. We're hearing good things with Jules Montanar, which is the other DB coach that they brought on. Obviously, those guys have great, resumes, and we've heard some good things, but we've seen Brian Johnson in action for the last few years, and he's been a great guy to bring in recruits for Florida. That's going to be a big loss for them, especially when they want to move from a team that has good seasons and kind of middle seasons to a team that has consistently high season. That's something that we talked about earlier, that long-term versus short-term. So it'll be interesting to see how they kind of adapt to not having Brian Johnson on the recruiting trail. They brought up McGee. He was an analyst for Florida, so he was promoted within the program, and they actually announced that maybe like a couple hours after the Brian Johnson move. So something that they were already planning. They kind of figured that Brian Johnson was going to leave in the off season. We already heard that he was having, interviews for several head coaching jobs in the college football ranks like South Carolina and Boise State. So they were prepared for this. McGee does have experience. He's obviously coached 1 year Lamar Jackson and Louisville. So he has offensive experience and, becoming OC. So he definitely has the resume for it, but it's going to be interesting to see how he handles the recruiting trail aspect, especially how recruiting has changed the last few years. And we're still in the middle of the pandemic. I know we mentioned earlier how it was a quiet National Signing Day. And honestly, it was quiet too, because we are in the middle of the pandemic and kids aren't allowed to take official visits. Usually around this time, we have a few kids still holding out on their decisions because they're able to take official visits in January. Some kids don't like taking visits during their football season, so they wait till January to take them. They can't do that right now. So we're interested to see how these guys still adapt. Florida, I talked to you about this during early signing day. Florida benefited a little bit from the pandemic and the rule changes to kind of accommodate, because a lot of the guys they were able to sign, like Corey Collier, visited Florida like in 2019 in the summer for a 7-on-7 tournament. But because there's no official visits, some of these recruits were not able to visit the Clemsons or the Alabamas or, the Ohio States because they couldn't go on an official visit. And a lot of these kids rely on those official visits to visit those schools. So Florida benefited from it. Like there's a lot of things that we say that Florida was hindered by the pandemic, but a lot of those in-state kids, they were able to visit Florida as a freshman or a sophomore because it was close to, because they don't have to travel that far. Florida benefited. A lot of the in-state schools, if you look across this country, benefit from that. So Florida did pick up those guys. Now the question is, what's going to happen when official visits start going up again? A lot of questions for 2021.
Yeah, what you're saying makes total sense. I've made the same statement a number of times. I don't have the metrics to back it up, but it sounds like you've looked into it a little bit, that the schools that have the talent right there in their own backyard are going to benefit from this versus the schools that have to go thousands of miles away to get and gain most of their impact players, like Nebraska. Nebraska is probably the classic example that goes to South Florida for players, that goes to California, that goes to Texas, and is very limited by that. Where Ohio State, they're in the same boat to a certain extent, but the name brand has carried them. Plus, Ohio is a better football playing state than Nebraska. But Nebraska's in a difficult position. But Florida staying home, if they can continue to take advantage, and then transition to normal life, hopefully again, continue the recruiting prowess. We got Jackie Franchuli on the line from allgators.com on SI, talking up the Florida Gators. Jackie, I hate college football scheduling. I love to talk about it, and that's probably the reason. I love to rant and rave about it, and coming up next week, I'm going to release my fix for college football scheduling. But as it stands right now, I don't think anybody's going to be implementing my changes for 2021. We've got a Gators schedule that includes a very Florida-centric theme to it, out of conference against FAU and South Florida out of the gate, and of course, the annual rivalry game against Florida State to close the season. But there's a game 3 encounter that may cause a little bit of buzz against Alabama.
Right. That game, I think everyone circled on their calendars. But I just want to make a note. I kind of missed the All-SEC schedule already. I think we were spoiled in 2020. I know it was a weird season, but I loved having all SEC conference. It was conference schedules. I didn't miss those cupcake games.
The cupcake games, no, of course, not the cupcake games, but you don't miss the big matchup against a non-conference foe or the Florida State game.
See, I did miss the Florida State game, but at the same time this year, it's Florida State.
They're down.
It was not going to be a good game. It was going to be, again, no disrespect, it was going to be a cupcake game, just at the level that Florida was playing compared to Florida State. But I just really liked the SEC schedule. I thought it was great seeing Texas A&M and Florida play against each other. I also love the fact that we got to see Felipe Franks play against Florida 1 year after he transferred. We never thought we were going to see that storyline. And so those are things I will miss. But the Alabama game is certainly one that I feel like kind of ties back to everything we've been talking about, is to see how far Florida has really come. And I know a lot of people were saying, well, the Alabama and SEC championship game shows how far Florida has really come. And I say not really. I think what we're going to see is the big struggle and challenge for any college football team to have continuity is to see if they can reload year in, year out. Obviously, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State have figured out the way to do it. They've been reloading every year, and they're always in playoff contention and national championship contentions. And they always have like a second 5-star rate waiting in the depth chart. Florida doesn't have that. And this is where we're going to see how they really have come far, because in the SEC championship game, they played Alabama pretty tightly. It was a good game. It was a very competitive game. 1 year later, when Florida has lost, Kyle Pitts, Kadarius Toney, Kyle Trask, after they miss all those guys, Trey Grimes, all those guys from the offense, and they're, rebuilding a new offense under a new quarterback, Alabama is losing, Heisman candidates, 2 Heisman candidates. So when you look at that, and Heisman winner. So when you look at that, if Alabama beats Florida convincingly, you say, yeah, Florida has a long way to go. If it's a close matchup between the teams, you can say that Florida is finally there. Even if they lose, that you can say that Florida is finally getting to that point. It's a work in progress, but if Florida and Alabama play close, that means whatever Dan Mullen is doing in Gainesville is working. Obviously, you want them to win if you're a Florida fan, but you have to, take some positives from that, because that's going to be where you're going to kind of see the progress. That's your barometer. If it's close or if you win, that means you're on the right track. If you lose by a lot, that means there has to be something changed, because obviously you're not going to reach the playoffs if you don't figure out what's going wrong. And again, it goes back to recruiting. Are you doing stuff that's short-term or long-term gain? If transfer portal is short-term gain, maybe you need to reevaluate having so much emphasis on the transfer portal and just rely it for maybe 1 or 2 players rather than, what is it? Let's see, 3 defensive linemen. But is it 5 players now? I think it's from the transfer portal. Yeah, so 5. So maybe that's where your focus shouldn't be in. So yeah, that Alabama game is going to be a game that I'm looking at, not just because I think it's going to be a good game, but also because that is the game where I think will really show how far Dan Mullen has truly come at Florida.
Yeah, when you take an Alabama and to lose not just the talent, but the experienced talent that they're losing at key positions all over the place, nobody's doubting that they're going to compete for an SEC and national championship again next year. But to your point, I think everybody puts together, despite the ascent that Dan Mullen has taken this program on, even prior to the Kyle Trask year of 2020, that you could see the steps being taken toward elite status, that because of some of the disappointments of 2020, because it seemed like, okay, this is just this super hyper powered offense that's an aberration, possibly we'll have to wait and see. And then you look at the recruiting ranking that's strong, but it's not to where it needs to be to keep up with the schools that you mentioned that constantly have a 1, 2, or 3 next to their name, both in the rankings and the recruiting rankings. It'll be just fascinating to see, and especially since you've got that super powerhouse of a recruiting machine in the same division in Georgia, how this plays out over the next couple of years.
Correct. Yeah. So it'll be I think that game will tell us a lot to see what's going to happen as far as, what's the next step for Dan Mullen. I think right now that is the question. Honestly, 2020 was a letdown at the end of the day for Florida. You went in there thinking of, college football playoffs. Then you lost to Texas A&M, but then you're sneaking in there. It's like, oh, you know what? We still have a chance. We still have a chance. We still have a chance. Then you lose to LSU because a player threw a shoe. Obviously, there's other stuff that went wrong in that game too. It's just that I feel like that moment really, really honestly summed up the end of the season for Florida. So I think 2020 was a letdown for them. And I think now you're thinking, what's next for Dan Mullen? He's not on the hot seat, but if he loses to Alabama in a big way, well, you're thinking, okay, well, some changes need to happen. If not, maybe he will be on the hot seat eventually. So that game, I feel like it's going to mean a lot for Florida either way.
The pluses and minuses for the 2020 version of Florida football were so egregious on either end of the spectrum. On the positive side, you beat Georgia. You finally win the East. You get to the championship game. You don't beat Alabama, but you give them by far their toughest game of the season. Mm-hmm. Opposite side, some of the Dan Mullen hysteria and theatrics, plus the end of the season, the Cotton Bowl letdown, and of course, probably more so than anything, what you just pointed to, the shoe throwing against LSU that cost them the game.
Yeah,
Jackie Franchuli. Yeah.
Florida got hit a lot national perception wise for 2020. Florida went from being, honestly, that year should have been, Florida was the darling of the media. With what they had on offense, they should have been the darling of the media. Kyle Trask is one of the most likable guys I've ever interviewed. And yet no one really focused on Kyle Trask until towards the end of the season, really. Because there was so much other stuff to talk about Florida, which is a shame, really. But yeah, Florida became the villain of 2020.
You can hear the obvious insight into Florida football and the recruiting, the personnel, the coaching changes, everything involved with the Gators. So please join Jackie on allgators.com on SI. Jackie, we always appreciate you stopping by, breaking down Florida football for us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.